everyone. As you saw from the last session, there's more to life than SMS. There are plenty of channels available to enterprises and organizations of all sizes to communicate with stakeholders all around the world. So thanks to Infobit for that session. Now, next up is XConnect's sponsored session looking at number information services as an enabler for communications platform as a service, CPaaS. And I'd like to introduce to you the moderator for this session, who is Nick Lane. Nick, welcome.
Hi, James. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Nick. I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, you seem to be doing okay. Your name and your company have been mentioned several times already during the event, so you must be doing something right.
Excellent. Good to hear.
Yeah, which is excellent. And I will leave you to it. Enjoy your session.
Thank you very much, James. So we need to introduce Tim from XConnect. And here he is. Hello, Mr. Ward.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, and I think, we'll probably do this very much as a shared session. I think this is, the way Nick and I have been looking at this is pretty much as a chat between the two of us, which I hope you'll find interesting. And I'll give kind of a little bit of background to that. But the first thing I should say is, although the last session ran over, I was really enjoying it so much. So thanks, Andreas. There was good questions at the end of it. And it also provided, I think, a very good lead-in to this particular session. Obviously, this is an event very much focused on the wholesale world. And what I think that last session did a very good job of doing was introducing the importance of CPaaS concepts, platforms, the whole idea of providing sort of business services as a platform and its relevance to the wholesale world. I think on the one hand, it's clearly a move, a change, something a little bit new in the marketplace, which is generating a whole load of traffic that the wholesale provider is going to be responsible for handling. But I think there's also another twist to that, in that as we work with some of those companies who I think you traditionally think of as a wholesale global service provider, whether voice or whatever, but connectivity provider, we're seeing a good number of them looking at the fact that they've got a global footprint, they've got global connectivity, they've got a global base of business customers. And that puts them in a very good position to actually become CPaaS providers in their own right, to actually take part in those services and provide those to their existing business customers. And I think it changes that role a little. Obviously those wholesalers have for many years been providing business services in straight connectivity, but it's shifting that value add into a space that's all around the applications that are key to those business communications. So this was the reason why we kind of themed this session around this subject. We as XConnect, I'm sure as you'll hear me talk through this, you'll understand why we are so interested in it. And we've also sort of partnered up with Mobilesquared and Nick to look into specific research in this area as to what is important. What do the CPaaS players care about? What are these applications having to deal with? And that's how we thought we would go through this session, talking about some of the key observations that's come out of the research that Nick has been doing, and get a few comments from us, both from a sponsorship point of view, so I want to tell you how great we are, but also just in terms of some of the observations we get back from our customers. Just a moment about XConnect. I know obviously we're pretty active within the MEF, so many of you will have met both myself and my and the rest of the team at XConnect. However, just to kind of give you that sort of thumbnail sketch, I mean, our primary business is that of being an information provider. We collect information from regulators, from numbering administrators, from carriers, from operators, from industry groups. And we aggregate all of that information together. It's an interesting challenge. That's probably the best way I can describe it. It's very inconsistent. We have to do a lot of error recovery of information that's provided to us that might not be consistent between different sources. So most of our work is not really about just the collection. It's actually about correcting and making that information usable, making it accessible to people. And then we provide that as both query services and as database services to the industry. And now, traditionally, well, I say over the last 5-6 years, over which XConnect has been an information provider, our primary services have been to the A2P providers, the business messaging world, and the messaging world is what has driven us. However, I would say in the last 2 years, our focus has moved very much to include voice. And we are seeing a growing number of voice service providers who need that information to help them validate, provide fraud protection, improve their routing, or look at some of the revenue issues that they're running into with surcharges and the variable rating that comes about, which means you need to know about the number, who owns it, who's responsible for it. So whilst a huge part of our business is in providing number portability data, real-time queries, pretty much live, another part of that is in providing just very basic information, who's responsible for a range. So that is kind of what we do. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Sonos. Sonos, a US company who provide a number of sort of data services, very complementary with those of XConnect. They run or are responsible for administrating the North American number plan and handle the toll-free number registration and administration process. There's a number of other databases as well used for the administration of the US network, but one very important new kind of requirement, which is being driven out of regulatory requirements, has been the DNO list, do not originate list. So providing some of those data sets, those pieces of information which are managing the validation and communication between service providers for voice and messaging. So, sorry, I probably spent far too long talking about us. I think the really interesting bit here is Nick. So, Nick, if I could ask you to also give a little introduction. I think most people know you. You have, as was mentioned by James just now, been referred to in just about every presentation in the information that Mobilesquared are providing. So, please, if you, anyway.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Well, let me share my screen. So what we're going to do is we've been working with XConnect to do a little bit of research into understanding what are some of the business and operational challenges that are facing the CPaaS world. And sorry, right.
There we go.
Here we go. Okay. There we go. Can we see that okay?
Looking good.
Excellent. Right. Okay. So we're, yes, trying to do two things is very difficult for me. So let's just do one. So let's just focus on what we've been doing. So for the last 18 months as a company, Mobilesquared has been researching CPaaS. We've been talking about it for a long time. And I'm delighted to say that we actually will release our CPaaS research next week. And that will then follow with a webinar the following week. But for the last couple of months, we've been working very closely with XConnect, trying to look at, as I mentioned, understand the business and operational challenges that are facing CPaaS providers or companies moving into CPaaS. So what we're going to do over the next half hour or so is really look at the market opportunity for CPaaS, look at the impact on fraud, and obviously from understand where number information services are coming to fall into that, all from a wholesale perspective. I'm hoping some of you are familiar with Mobilesquared. For those of you that aren't, you can see a list of all of our clients here. We're business messaging intelligence specialists. We've been shaping the industry with our research and forecasts for the last 10 years or so, looking specifically at SMS, RCS, WhatsApp, and obviously now we're adding CPaaS to that across 14 channels. So first things up, one thing that we have been trying to work out and define is what is CPaaS. Now, of all the companies that we've been speaking to, and we've spoken to about 130 as part of our research over the last year in particular, specifically with regard to CPaaS, everyone has their own opinion. So based on all of our research, we have now created this, as you can see on the screen. So we now define CPaaS as the capability to provide real-time cloud-based omnichannel communications via an API to connect brands and consumers. So just to expand on that a little and very, very briefly, what we're saying then is UCaaS does not fall within CPaaS. Lots of people have told us they believe it is, but we don't believe it does. We believe B2C, C2B is where CPaaS is, which also means that CCaaS and customer care does fall in to a CPaaS definition, providing, of course, it's via an API. And I think the whole via an API is key to that. Otherwise, the size of the market would be hundreds of billions rather than what we're saying it is, which is... So this year, we think CPaaS will be worth $29.7 billion. And over our forecast period to the end of 2026, we believe that it will rise to $52.8 billion. As you can see on the pie chart here, you've got the breakdown, and the majority of this, so 67% or so of all revenue this year is going to come from messaging, and a large percentage of that, well into the 90% or so of that, is SMS. So A2P SMS really is the platform upon which CPaaS is growing. The next biggest section, as we see it from the research, is voice. That's followed by email. Obviously then you've got 4 other sections or channels: in-app, video, social media, and web. And these are pretty much, we'd say, kind of tertiary channels at the moment, based on where the market is and where it's coming from in the CPaaS perspective.
And I think, Nick, I mean, that's one bit where I'd pull out the observation that major proportion, about really 3/4 of that pie chart, or more than 3/4 of that pie chart, is really dependent on numbers, on phone numbers. I still feel, I find this debate, and I don't know whether you had this debate whilst doing your research, that kind of the identifier that people are using is predominantly still a phone number. It's one of the few identifiers that's recognized as being kind of global and universal, and is simply a necessity to have as much insight and as much information about those numbers as you can possibly have to make your CPaaS offering work. As simple as that. So I don't know whether you had any kind of feedback about kind of the identifiers that are being used, but I don't know if you have any comment there.
I don't.
No, okay. That's fair enough.
I mean, the thing that we've been looking at really is trying to understand and ascertain what are kind of the CPaaS user landscape, and the way that we've approached this is really kind of basing it around smartphone numbers, because in order to access all of these channels, you need a smartphone. So whilst you could say that there would be elements, obviously, that would of some of the channels would kind of include and incorporate a PC, for example. Ultimately, if you, in terms of message, in terms of voice, email, in-app push, etc., the only way that you can access all of these channels from a consumer perspective and from a brand perspective is really via that smartphone. So that's
I knew you had a comment about it.
I've got a comment for everything. So that's kind of that's always been our base. So one of the things that we've also identified is that so as part of our research, we've identified the top 40 CPaaS providers based on revenue and research, looking at their revenue from 2020, 2021, for example. 75% of all the companies in the top 40 cover messaging background. So again, this kind of supports what you're just saying, Tim, in terms of where we are coming from CPaaS as an industry. So it's largely formed upon messaging. Therefore, a lot of the growth and a lot of what's happened in terms of CPaaS activity in the last couple of years has been based on consolidation, as messaging specialists look to acquire specialists of other channels. So we've seen a lot of convergence around voice and email in particular, and we expect that will obviously extend out to the other channels that we look at. But we see that this is going to be a massive, massive driver for CPaaS over our forecast period, and convergence in particular, looking at voice, as voice becomes quite a key channel, a dominant channel in CPaaS over the coming years. But as we've looked at the research, it's clear that convergence consolidation is going to be very key for CPaaS moving forward, but it's also going to throw up a number of challenges. So as you can see on here, Tim, and people, we asked as part of our research on behalf of XConnect, what are the business challenges facing CPaaS? And as you can see, the biggest response really, which was about 55%, was service integration. That's followed by platform integration. Network integration was about 25%. So integration is clearly on people's minds. So Tim, from your perspective, looking at the business challenges that the companies participating in the research have identified, is there anything that kind of stands out from your perspective?
Well, it is, you've put your finger on it in terms of that integration, and also this point about how so many of the CPaaS players have come from either a voice position and are now trying to get into messaging, or they've come from messaging trying to get into voice. And they are different worlds. They are distinctly different worlds, right down at the mechanics of how some of the routing and charging and delivery optimization actually takes place. And I think it's helping companies that may have a great deal of experience and expertise in one side, trying to help them offer the same levels of service, because that's what their customers care about. They want to know that they will get successful delivery, and that they will, I think we're going to come on to this, but they'll avoid some of the fraud possibilities. And in each world, they have a different twist to them. So how can you actually bridge that gap? And certainly that's one of the biggest questions we're being asked. We do have that great advantage that, numbering and the underlying networks that provide that kind of information do bridge the gap, or does bridge the gap. And so that's a particular way that I think we're helping.
Okay, great. You mentioned fraud.
Yeah.
That was obviously a key part of understanding what some of the challenges moving forward. So before we get on to the fraud, and as you can see, we've got some figures there based on the research. Operational issues are obviously those associated with CPaaS. They covered a number of things in terms of what was raised during the research. Fraud management was the standout, with almost 70% of respondents saying that obviously that is one of their issues moving forward. But again, before we actually come on to the revenue leakage research and our numbers, Tim, again, and from the operational side of things, what stands out? But you can't mention fraud management just yet, because obviously that's our segue into the next bit. So anything else?
Well, it's an interesting one, and although it's kind of not in your top 3 or 4, the fact that these platform providers are also being asked to handle financial transactions, I think, is a really interesting observation. It means that they're spanning from just being a communications provider to being a transaction provider. And again, I'll kind of tell the story that we're seeing an almost similar environment there, where the need for routing a transaction, the need for validating a transaction, is very often linked straight back to the telephone number. It's being used as an identifier, not the identifier, but an identifier. It's an attribute. And recognizing that where maybe the carriers are taking part in some of those financial transactions, either for providing validation services or even actually as a financial services provider themselves, you actually need to know which operator is responsible for a number. So I kind of make that point that a number of these areas are very much around, I've got to make sure the number is good. I've got to make sure I know who it belongs to as an operator, as a service provider. And then I'm able to enable a range of services and make sure that those are going to complete and not have a very high failure rate. I always remind everybody, in most countries that have got number portability, you're looking at 20 to 30% of those numbers in a population having been moved from their original carrier. So it immediately means if you're not using number port corrected information, you're going to get it wrong 20 to 30% of the time. You will route to the wrong place, and that will lead to delays. It'll lead to revenue loss. It'll lead to a number of these other things. So that's maybe just one standout item in there amongst all of these others.
Okay, thank you. So fraud management, almost 70% of respondents said that that's one of their operational issues. I thought it was quite interesting actually that traffic inflation was about 15%, given that that's quite a hot topic at the moment across a number of channels. I'm surprised that was so low, but maybe it's because companies had already answered the fraud management. Might explain that one. But from our research, and again from the research that we did, this is specifically for XConnect, where we basically did the research and we've overlaid that onto our CPaaS numbers and model. It's suggested by people in the industry in CPaaS companies that potentially revenue leakage from fraud and platform inefficiencies could cost CPaaS close to $1 billion in 2022, rising to $1.4 billion by 2026. As you can see, that accounts for 3.3% of total CPaaS revenue this year, 2.6% by 2026. So things could be becoming locked down over that period. But I think it's also worth noting that cumulatively, what could be lost to this revenue leakage over this period is about $6 billion. That's a big amount of money, and that's a daily revenue leakage just this year alone of $2.7 million. So although it's a small percent of overall revenue, it still accounts for a massive amount of money that's lost. So Tim, what are your thoughts on that? Is that alarming? Is that lower than you expected? What would you have thought?
So there's a couple of things. One is, where does that money go? And I mean, I still find it quite frightening that in some businesses, kind of people just build that leakage into their budgets and just assume that's money that's going to be lost. What worries me about is where that money goes, in that it's often going to, serious crime. It's funding other forms of crime, which just cannot be a good thing. I know this is said many times, but it's certainly what strikes you immediately. The other side of this, I would kind of point out, I guess. Now, I like to think I know what our customers do. I know how they use our data in the particular applications, but it astonishes me every time I go and talk to someone new who is sort of looking at how they can use information about telephone numbers. They come up with some new ideas and some new observations, and this is where it is shocking. When I find out the volume of traffic where one of those is sort of callback fraud, and it probably falls into the general fraud bucket, but we're seeing a platform being asked to either return a call or provide a one-time code or generate some traffic to a number that is provided by an external user, and that external user may have provided a premium rate number, or they may have provided a number that simply doesn't exist, but is causing some form of network fraud, some form of network traffic inflation. And it comes back to this traffic inflation as well. We're seeing those situations where traffic is being inflated for the very good reason of just generating additional traffic into premium rate numbers. And this can be a huge problem. So validating that those numbers exist, validating that which operator they belong to if you need to go back and dispute how that traffic is being used, being able to identify whether they are premium rate numbers and therefore should not be receiving some kind of one-time code or something of that sort. Some of these are really, really simple. You don't need smart AI or smart information. It's basic information, and we're very good at that. So I like to think that that's an area which, although you're looking at a very complex, very high level of fraud, there are some really basic things that can be done that will have an instant impact on it. And a number of our customers who are in the call center and then moving through into the CPaaS world are recognizing that there are some of those basic checks make really good sense to do before they even launch a return call.
So question for you then, Tim. So the percentage of revenue leakage in CPaaS is around 3%. So beyond that, if you look at what the revenue leakage in terms of lost revenue from A2P SMS, it stands at about 6-7%. So it does seem that as we move to more channels, that things are becoming more secure. Would that be correct, or is it because ultimately whatever fraudulent activity is potentially happening on A2P SMS is yet to really kind of make that transition across multiple channels into the CPaaS world? So as yet, that's kind of what it could be, but just not wanting to scaremonger, but it could be phenomenally worse.
I think it could be phenomenally worse. I think it is also one where the good news is that I think virtually every company is trying to address it. When I think of 5 years ago, I don't think they were. That's where my comment about people just building it into their budgets kind of comes from. And it is a little bit of a historical view in just assuming that that's a loss and it's cheaper to budget for it than it is to try to address it. However, when there are professional organizations that are really trying to take advantage of these loopholes in the way that platforms are being managed, it becomes critical that the platform provider, not just the user of that platform, but the actual provider of the platform, is able to provide the tools that can keep this under control. And I think we all know with all of these fraudulent things, this phrase whack-a-mole is always being referred to. Knock it down in one place, it'll pop up somewhere else. And I'm sure that's the case. However, we've just got to keep on knocking it down. And that's the only way that it can be addressed. Otherwise, it'll grow out of control. And I think that's your point, where you see some of these fraudulent techniques applying in one market that can actually translate into another. When platforms are made freely available, you have to make sure those skills are not transferable. They've got to be kept under control in each environment. So I think that's a real problem, but I think it is very, very addressable by some pretty basic, pretty simple approaches.
Yep. Okay. So one of our, again, key findings from the research then is the impact that voice is going to have on expected fraud across CPaaS. In terms of 2022, we expect voice to account for 34% of total fraud, and that will increase to 39% by 2026. So clearly, fraud is most likely to happen across voice, given that our research covers 14 channels. This is one channel, and it's going to account for more than a third of potential fraud. You can see in terms of the numbers from the chart that we expect fraud in terms of voice to be around 330 million in 2022, rising to about 550 million by 2026. So the chances are that with voice is probably going to suffer more revenue leakage and ultimately more and more attacks as it becomes a bigger channel within CPaaS. So Tim, what's your take on that?
Well, I think there's two takes on it. One is, voice for many years has been voice. The rates for a voice call are just down to what's the minutes for terminating a call to a particular destination. That's actually gone through a real transformation in the last few years, where we now have origin-based rating. People are now saying it depends where the call came from as to what the termination rate is actually going to be. That is a whole new complexity, which the carriers, the operators, the service providers, and the CPaaS providers are still learning how to deal with. You need to know both the origin and the destination, and you need to manage those effectively and keep them under control. I think there's another lesson which we can learn from the messaging world, which is messaging has an absolutely clear distinction between person-to-person messaging and the rates which are charged for that and the bilateral agreements that exist around it, and the business messaging world, where it's clearly seen as a premium service. It has real value to the enterprises that are using it, and as such, the termination rates are quite different. And probably quite rightly so too, because there's a lot of additional work that needs to be done to manage those messages. I think that also is a message to the voice world, where being able to provide more business-focused messaging capabilities, whether that's about security, delivery assurance, certainty of the identity of particular calls. We heard on the last call the ability to provide rich information about the caller ID. All of those are things which would differentiate a voice call and give an opportunity for the carriers to actually increase their termination rates. Unfortunately, increased termination rates leads to it being much more attractive from a fraud perspective. So I think kind of that balance between those 2 points is a key one. I did notice also as a question which was raised by the audience just now about, worded as which parts of the world is leading the charge when it comes to suboptimal practices, which I think is a lovely phrase for describing the bad boys. Actually, I should say bad boys and girls. There's no distinction there. And I don't know, Nick, whether you've got any particular views from the statistics, as I know you gather a lot of that information on kind of where fraud.
We are still processing that, so not at liberty to say just yet.
No, that's I'm sure true. And I think, from our perspective, we're seeing almost wherever markets are less regulated. Now, I'm not a great proponent of regulation. The industry should regulate itself. However, it is quite clear that where the regulations are open to abuse, or because they simply don't exist, that tends to make an easier environment for organizations to do bad things. Now, if regulation can actually be industry driven and we're actually paying attention to these problems ourselves, that is an even better solution to the problem, and making sure we can weed out where the bad operators are. That's what will influence the locations where it takes place. Now, I still understand that an awful lot of fraud comes from North America and the UK, two markets which are fairly closely watched. But all the same, I think making sure the industry pays attention to that is going to be key.
Okay, and just to come back to what you just said in terms of termination rates charges there, Tim, in terms of threats to voice.
Yeah.
Termination rate charges and traffic inflation identified as the biggest threats to the brand voice spend over the coming years. So again, is that so for example, looking at what's going on in messaging with the international rates as they go up exponentially in terms of the pricing, obviously that's forcing changes into the dynamics of the market and that traffic, encouraging more grey route, and obviously within the grey route you're going to get more fraudulent traffic. So is it going to be something similar that potentially could happen with voice, or is it a fundamentally different market?
It is a fundamentally different market, but I think the results will be the same. The mechanics of how that actually happens will be a little different. I think as ever, the termination rates are a balancing act. One is around keeping the channel clean. In other words, preventing huge amounts of spam and unsolicited traffic of whatever sort. If the rates are very low, you get a lot of spam because it's cheap to send it. And it's very difficult to control that and manage that environment. If the rates are high, someone will find some other channel. They will find some other way of getting at their destinations. It also comes out that just the measurement, if your termination rates are high, we've seen some countries looking at sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 cents per message as a termination rate. That creates a real inducement, a real interest in finding fraudulent ways of getting around those termination rates and trying to undercut them. If the termination rates were lower, there would be less of a motivation for the fraud in that environment. And the losses, quite simple, halve your termination rate, your loss is halved. Now, I know that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but it is kind of the maths of it. So if the rates are high, the fraud will look high as well. Again, I think it comes down to there are measures that can be taken for both voice and messaging, some of which are simple, some of which are complex, some of which are rules-based. And I think it's ensuring that the platforms have the ability to apply these intelligent techniques to manage this.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think our time's going to be very soon up, Tim.
Absolutely.
So that is the end of our kind of key statements from the research. So I just will leave it with you to kind of wrap up. What do you think all of this means to the wholesale community?
Well, you know, I think the wholesale community really does have, as I kicked off this session, two ways of looking at this. One is the opportunity from the CPaaS providers who are going to generate more and more traffic and building services which are going to be attractive to them, building termination rates, the ability to manage traffic, the ability to handle some of these, you know, this has just been half of our conversation today, manage the fraudulent environments that are out there. Traditionally, the wholesalers have not really had to worry quite so much about that. It's been more of a retail issue. Now, that might be a vast overstatement, but I would say when I see who's really been worried about it. However, we have really seen the wholesale providers step up. They're looking at ways of validating caller identity. They're looking at ways of stripping out possible fraudulent traffic. We're looking at ways of avoiding terminating traffic that is doing bad things. But those wholesalers can do a lot to help the CPaaS provider and build services that complement what the platforms are providing. The other side of it is where the wholesaler is looking to provide those services themselves, take advantage of their global footprint, their global experience, their global knowledge, and apply that to this business application world where clearly, you know, from the figures you're providing there, Nick, the opportunity is huge. This is kind of a growth space where people are moving from these very specialized messaging or voice or call center, whatever it happens to be. This is all coming together into platform environment, and you're looking at the ability to use an API that's consolidating a whole lot of applications onto single platforms, which is a game changer. So I think from that point of view, the attractiveness of this segment and being able to serve this segment for all of us, and that includes us as well, making sure our services are well adapted for the CPaaS segment, makes just total sense. So, you know, and I have to say, Nick, thank you so much. I mean, as ever, your research is extremely insightful. I also love very often the fact that it's not exactly what I hear from everybody else. It puts a different twist on it. And I think your sort of insight to what is going on in this space and the close links to the key players in it really helps us, you know, have good information about kind of what's going on and, you know, how we need to respond to the particular problems in these markets. So I hope everybody will also find this information, which we've been working together with Nick to collect, is useful to their deliberations in what direction to go.
That's very kind, Tim. Thank you. And obviously, the white paper, we're looking to get that out in the next couple of weeks, aren't we?
Absolutely. So,
yeah. And I've just seen that we had 3 minutes to wrap up 8 minutes ago, so we've overrun. So
we've overrun.
Tim, thanks very much. Hopefully everyone found that useful. And then we'll pass you back to James.